By way of introduction, thank you so much, Dr. Seniors, for agreeing to have a conversation with us. My name is Sonya Donaldson. I am the interim director of the Lee Hagan Africana Studies Center at New Jersey City University. I'm also the coordinator of the African and African American Studies program here, in addition to teaching in the program. Dr. Seniors is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Virginia Tech and the biographer of her family's legacy with the forthcoming book, A. Mallory, The Monroe Defense Committee and World Revolutions, African American Women Radical Activists, 1956 to 1987. Seniors won the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize from the Association of Black Women Historians for her magnificent book, Beyond Lift Every Voice and Sing, The Culture of Uplift, Identity, and Politics in Black Musical Theater. She did not tell me to say it was magnificent, but it she co-edited the anthology, Michelle Obama's Impact on African American Women and Girls, and wrote Reconfiguring Black Motherhood, Michelle Obama and the Mom in Charge Trope, which appears in the book. She's published work on Scott Joplin's 1911 opera Tremonisha for the Library of Congress. And so she's going to be very busy in the coming years because I've been kind of pressing her for that book, the Scott Joplin book. So she's going to be busy for a very long time. She's also written Bob Cole's Colored Man's Declaration of Independence and Black Broadway, The Case of Cole and Johnson's Shoefly Regiment, and George C. Wolfe's Shuffle Along. And that's in the Routledge Companion to African American Theater and Performance. And she's written May Mallory and the Southern Belle fantasy trope in From Uncle Tom's Cabin to The Help. In addition to her May Mallory books, Seniors is on Michelle Obama's Silence, Police and State Violence Against African American Girls and Women. And this is a project that is also highly anticipated by me, as some of my work is on Black girlhood and the intersections of the maternal and state and extra-legal violence against Black and women. So I've had the good fortune of hearing Dr. Seniors, May Mallory, and her family's history of activism. And I look forward to today's conversation, as well as hearing more from this very important work and from you. My goal here is to sort of recede into the background so that you can have a lovely conversation with Dr. Seniors. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Paula Marie Seniors.
Thank you so very much. And hopefully the book is coming out in University Georgia Press. Hopefully soon.
Yes, it will. We will make it so. So I'm going to be helping out a little bit with the PowerPoint. So please forgive us as we try to, we sort of work through this, but we continue to try and perfect it. So I'm going to start the PowerPoint and then we'll have to go back a little bit, I guess.
Okay.
For some reason. Oh, okay,
that's perfect. That's perfect.
Oh.
So in 1961, African-American women, working class, I'm sorry, can you go to the next slide, please? In 1961, African-American working class self-defense advocate May Mallory traveled from New York to Monroe to provide support and weapons to the Negroes with Guns movement. Accused of kidnapping a Ku Klux Klan couple, she spent 13 months in a Cleveland jail facing extradition. Next slide, please. African-American women radical activist, Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson of the Negroes with Guns movement, my adopted grandmother, my mother, Audrey Proctor Seniors of the band New Orleans National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Ruthie Stone, and my father, Clarence Henry Seniors, both of the Workers' World Party, founded the Monroe Defense Committee to support Mallory. Her 16-year-old daughter, Pat, also participated. They all bonded permanently as a family. And when the case ended, Pat, May, and Audrey joined revolutionary movements in Tanzania, Grenada, and Nicaragua. And Mrs. Johnson advocated for world revolutions through her column, Did You Know, in The Crusader. These women emerged as what Antonio Gramsci and George Lipset defined as organic intellectuals, studying their world and disseminating their ideas through social contestation, guiding the thoughts and desires of their class without an official intellectual position. So what we want to know is what led these women and girls to actively participate in world revolutions. This first picture here is of me. I'm a little tiny baby with May Mallory and the Monroe Defense Committee. Next slide, please. So after Monroe, my mother and I visited May and Pat in their Harlem skyscraper with Malcolm X's photograph prominently displayed in their living room as it was in our Brooklyn living room. Sometimes my friend Hindi would come with us. Pat, May, and my mother would wrap us up in African gaylays on our heads and drape beautiful African fabrics around us. May was gregarious and wonderful with an infectious laugh and warm arms that embraced me. And Pat, a grown-up, a little older than teenager, with her beautiful afro, was beautiful and fun to be around. They made me feel cherished. This was my family. Slide, please. Quote, never have I any fear of white people, nor felt that I am inferior to anyone. May Mallory. In 1930, at the age of 3, while living with her cousin Tempia in Macon, Georgia, May formulated a self-defense ideology. A white female store owner, Mrs. Saloon, offered Black children maggot-filled cheese. Mallory, quote, I slapped that garbage out the woman's hands and she slapped me. And I ran home crying. So this cousin made me explain to her why I was crying. Somehow or another, I just told my cousin that this little girl had hit me. So she told me that I better go back. And even if Mary Saloon had curled up her mother's dress, I better hit her or I wasn't coming in the house. So I went back to the store and Mary Saloon was behind the counter and I went back there and I popped her, you see. And then I ran home. Mrs. Saloon called the police who came looking for, quote, this little nigger who had hit a white woman, end quote. Cousin Tempia castigated them. Why you white people are so stupid. You mean you had to have 15 motorcycle cops come for this? And she held up, you know, this little round fat ball of black flesh that was me. She said, now don't you look ridiculous, Mallory. She really made them feel a fool. So they told her that she would have to teach me that I would have to respect white people. So my cousin said that you tell them that they have to respect us, end quote. So Tempia gave May a self-defense model, which proved successful against white supremacists. And they were not retaliated against. The family was not retaliated against in a state that, according to Ida B. Wells, ranked #1 in lynching. So while May and Tempia escaped harm, Mallory recalled that they left Georgia soon after the incident for Brooklyn because, quote, my mother could see that I wasn't gonna make it so good in the South, end quote. Next slide. In Brooklyn, May wanted to be a scholar. The public schools and her family obstructed her aspirations. Quote, by the time I was 17, my family decided that I should get married. So they picked me a husband. Pregnant and married at 17 with Pat and 18 with Butch, May revolted. Quote, now I love babies, but I think there is something else in this life besides having a baby and rearing it. I left him with children in tow. And so she worked in factories and she chose a life of learning and political activism. However, she was unable to fully conjoin motherhood and activism. And this was notwithstanding the fact that she had brought a desegregation case against New York City in 1957 on Pat's behalf. Now, she found complete agency with the Negroes with Guns movement. And in Harlem, she founded the Crusader family to support them through fundraisers and arms. So you can move the slide forward. All right. So what happened in Monroe? So the national branch of the NAACP, the Freedom Riders, Martin Luther King Jr., and others sought to teach the Negroes with Guns movement, who had morphed from the NAACP, the effectiveness of passive resistance by sending the Freedom Riders to Monroe in 1961. Now, the Negroes with Gun movement anticipated white violence and called on their friends for physical support. May answered their call and traveled with weapons from her fundraisers and also from a Harlem gangster. August 27th, 1961, 5,000 Ku Klux Klan and police viciously attacked the demonstrators, invaded the militarized, heavily armed Black community, and a Ku Klux Klan couple pushed their way into the Williams home. They left unharmed. They were protected by the Williams. But May writes that Chief Monty, quote, threatened to have us all hanging by our heels within 30 minutes, end quote. So Williams abandoned Mallory in New York, and he and his family escaped to Cuba. When May learned that they all were accused of kidnapping the Stiegels, she fled to Cleveland, only to have her relatives turn her into the authorities. She spent 13 months in a jail and faced extradition. Using dream escape writing, she survived her incarceration. Slide. The wind moans around the 7th floor of Cleveland's skyscraper on 21st Street and Payne Avenue. It sounds like the pathetic cries of a dying prehistoric animal, according to Hollywood soundtracks. These moaning sounds are frightening to the inmates that are hearing them for the first time. This noise does not bother me. I am used to it. I have lived on the 12th floor of a New York City housing project. So May Mallory identifies 21st and Payne as what Catherine McKittrick calls a geography of domination, with prisoners within a Hollywood horror movie come to life, entrapped within the carcass of a dinosaurian structure, rendered invisible and robbed of their freedom. Mallory's own experience in New York City's projects buffered her from fearing the roaring dinosaur edifice, but she writes that it still was a menacing place. So upon her arrest, next slide, Cleveland's Monroe Defense Committee, what May call a group with a way out philosophy of self-defense against mobsters, came to her aid. Slide. Quote, slide. Mrs. Johnson always traveled with us from town to town for protest meetings as our babysitter, for she loved her granddaughter. Slide. The beautifully brown-skinned Mrs. Ethel Azalea Johnson, my adopted grandmother, was born in Abbeville, South Carolina in 1916. Abbeville played a pivotal role in Johnson's political, intellectual growth and informed her self-defense ideology. Abbeville's African Americans came from soldier stock from Sierra Leone, Gambia, Angola, and Senegal, and they participated in extreme militaristic and intellectual resistance to white supremacist violence. They defied death itself when faced with lynching. So this community, this Black community, built a historical community of struggle and resistance. And these ideologies Mrs. Johnson brought to Monroe's NAACP, the Negroes with Guns movement, and she brought to Philadelphia as the founder and co-chairman of Philadelphia's Revolutionary Action Movement. So in 1959, Monroe, after the loss of 2 rape cases where white rapists walked free, Mrs. Johnson pronounced, "The only alternative Black people have left is a self-defense policy." Thus, the Negroes with Guns movement was founded by Robert F. Williams, Dr. Perry, and Johnson to protect women and children with weapons. She also co-founded the Crusader newspaper, where her column, Did You Know, appeared. Now, her mother's life lessons also informed her ideology. Her mother, a maid and laundress, she wrote about in her column, quote, "My mother knew that she and her foreparents, along with millions of other Afro-Americans, had been deprived of their civil and human rights. In her unpolished way, my mother planted the seeds of discontent in her children, discontent with any and everything inhumane. Never rest contented," she'd say, "until all men are free." One thing the Jim Crow laws and discriminatory policies did not do to her was break her spirit and lust for freedom. Now, my mother never experienced living as a free person, but she was always free in her heart, end quote. Ethel Azalea Johnson's mother taught her children that they must free all African Americans, all aggrieved communities of color. Her mother suffused her children with freedom of heart, mind, and spirit, and her love and lessons shaped Johnson's ideologies. Slide. So during times of great stress, Johnson left Monroe for Philadelphia, Abbeville's sister city. She and her friend, 19-year-old Max Stanford, co-founded and co-chaired the Revolutionary Action Movement. As chair, Johnson charged colonized diasporic youth to lead world revolutions. In 1963, she wrote about RAM's response to police attacks on African-American demonstrators picketing for jobs. Quote, "Many African-Americans, after witnessing the attacks on their relatives and friends on the picket lines, left the demonstration, but returned with 45s and straight razors," end quote. So this offers us a window into her self-defense ideology and her influence on RAM's combat-ready youth. So the calamitous conditions of Monroe mirrored that of Batista's Cuba. Beginning in August 1960, Johnson and Williams exposed their readers to the connections between African-American poverty and poverty in Cuba, as well as world revolutions. Quote, 1961, "The teachings of Jesus Christ are what racist men call socialism today. The Cuban Revolution, the uprisings all over the world in Africa, Asia, and Latin America spelled death for the white supremacist ideology." And then she drew the connections to Monroe. One father was unemployed and sick. The mother hasn't been able to get up after giving birth 6 weeks ago. The children were ragged. The home was in need of everything. And the welfare agency refuses to give them any help. So in 1959, she modeled the Crusaders Association for Relief and Enlightenment after Cuban revolutionary initiatives. With the help of my parents, she did what the state would not do. They offered food, clothing, shoes, a food garden, and enlightenment. And they predated the 1970 Black Panthers free breakfast program. Now, finally, Mrs. Johnson and her husband advocated for world revolutions. 1966-67, quote, "We wish for all of you a new year filled with victories in the struggle for the liberation of oppression. We wish continual victories in the international liberation struggles. Long live the great leaders of the international liberation struggles. Long live the people of the international liberation struggles." Our New Year's toast: may the eyes of the people on the local front be open and their ears unstopped so that they may hear the roar of world revolution and do what must be done, for the strength of the organized masses is inevitable. And with this toast, the Johnsons connected world revolutions to the Congo, Vietnam, Cuba, Dominican Republic, to African American struggles. And she compelled her readers to join in her struggle, join her in the struggle for freedom. Slide. Oh boy, my mother was so glamorous and beautiful, standing in front of Malcolm X's photo in her mini dress, gele, and high heel shoes. Oh, she smelled wonderful. She felt wonderful. I remember as a 4 or 5-year-old watching my mother in her bedroom before a night out in her black, sparkly hot pants outfit, a cloud of powder wafting the air, haloing around her face. Sitting on her bed, her heartbeat, the softness of her when I put my head on her breast, ruining the Christmas of her beautiful hot pants outfit. But she didn't mind, my mother. So in New Orleans in 1958, slide, Audrey Proctor, a diminutive 17-year-old, a recent high school graduate, and an advocate for self-defense, took her initial steps towards radical activism. Quote, "My first involvement in the area of social and political change began in New Orleans in the late 1950s. Along with a number of my peers, I became a card-carrying member of the NAACP, which at that time was a very radical thing to do. Indeed, becoming a member of New Orleans NAACP proved extremely radical, given the FBI surveillance of the group in the 40s, because the members included Black female teachers, union members, communist members, and the working and middle class. In the 1956, the Citizens Council, the Ku Klux Klan in suits and ties, and the state made it illegal to belong to the NAACP. So my mother became radicalized by them, an unrepentant and unapologetic socialist and communist, follower of Paul Robeson, a lifelong advocate of unions, living wages, fair and decent working conditions, and affordable housing. Slide. In 1961, at 21, my mother moved to Cleveland, lived with her auntie Gladys, attended secretarial school, became an organic intellectual, analyzing Lenin, Marx, and Third World Revolutionary theory, supported Third World revolutions, became a devotee of the Negroes with Guns movement, joined the Trotskyist Workers' World Party, the Monroe Defense Committee as an office manager, met my father, Clarence Henry Sr., who chaired the committee, and she joined the Youth Against War and Fascism. Quote, in 1964, the extradition battle was lost. With 2 weeks I, along with my husband, made our way to Monroe to fight for May Mallory. End quote. Slide. In Monroe, she worked with Mrs. Johnson and wrote Monroe, North Carolina for the Partisan magazine in 1965. Quote, "It had been pitch dark for some time. I was out of cigarettes and just had to go to the store for a pack. A small group of Black men were standing there. I was alone, but not really afraid. So my mother unveils a Southern poor working class African-American male scenario of extreme poverty, of men, quote, always surrounded by all the small children of the neighborhood. They never at any season seemed to have a job or anything special to do," end quote. So Audrey allows us to see hope and love of the children for these men. But the state worked to keep Monroe's Black men unemployed, using man in the house and substitute father welfare laws that legally denied them and their partners' welfare, a life together, and a living wage. But through the window of the store, my mother watched them. Quote, "All of a sudden it happened. Before the storekeeper could get out of sight after dumping the last container of garbage, these men lit out to the trash pile so fast I was stunned. With tears in my eyes, I realized what was going on. I was not looking at a pack of hungry dogs who attack garbage cans at night. I was looking at men, would-be strong men, men who speak back to me as I say hello to them, respecting me as I respect them, grown men who I see every day." She was bereft over their transformation into beast. Quote, "There is no doubt in my mind that they want sincerely to be and would be good providers for their wives and children if they had a chance to make an honest living. But there is no chance for them in Monroe. There isn't even a chance to be nothing but a man." So in 1965, the Mallory case was won. May and our family moved to New York. My mother continued her activism. She joined the Black Panthers and marched for the Vietnam War. Slide. So, disillusioned by the outcomes of the civil rights movement, my mother traveled to Grenada to participate in their Marxist socialist revolution and to Nicaragua to participate in the Catholic Sandinista revolution. From 1984 to 1987, she worked as a brigadista in Nicaragua, picking coffee for the Sandinistas. In 1984, she met with the mothers of heroes and martyrs. One woman whose daughter perished at the hands of the Contras left an indelible imprint on my mother. She wrote in Brigadista Harvest, "The mother asked us to tell the mothers in the United States not to let their sons come to invade Nicaragua. We know what it is like to lose a child, and we do not wish it to happen to anyone else." This mother despairingly extended fellowship mother to mother, but with steely determination and courage warned, "If your sons come to invade us, they will be killed." That the Nicaraguan mothers would fight back and the casualties would be the visitors' own children. Now, this statement greatly affected my mother, for she wrote that, quote, "Many times since I have reflected on these words and what they mean for Black and Latino mothers and families here. History has shown in Vietnam and most recently in Grenada that it is Blacks and the poor who are on the front lines fighting United States dirty wars. Black mothers must bury our sons, and all of us suffer the emotional and economic hardship of their loss to our communities. Now, I believe that my mother felt insurmountable anguish, but with this, she committed herself to transforming the US system of exploitation by recruiting third whale brigades to Nicaragua, by giving interviews, speaking to African American organizations, and writing articles. Slide. So, the 1957 New York City school desegregation case left 12-year-old Pat blacklisted at school with a mother in jail. She was confused and devastated. But after this difficult early childhood, Pat arose like a phoenix, emerging as a Black nationalist rebel girl at Seward Park High School. Quote, I considered myself a Black nationalist since a teenager. Pat excelled at school as the president of the Negro Culture Club, the Multiracial Anti-Nuclear War Symposium Club, quote, because we were not trying to prepare for war, end quote. Pat attended Black nationalist activities in Harlem. Oh, we got very Afrocentric. We got our African names and the African beads representing one god or another, and that was it. I decided to go natural, and the singer Abby Mitchell, in fact, did my hair. Oh, I hung out with Mama KK's Harlem Yoruba Temple people. Pat attended Miss Natural Standard of Beauty contests, the Grandassa Mazzos fashion shows, the Nation of Islam's Temple 7, listening to Malcolm X, and verbally sparring with boxer Muhammad Ali. Oh, he was such a loudmouth, end quote. As a Black nationalist girl, she chose radical activism and advocated for change. Now, I remember when Pat went to the mythic Africa. We, my mother and I, went to the airport. Slide. I recall the utter excitement when Pat went on the plane. I remember picking her up when she returned after the big bus instigated by the CIA to destabilize Tanzania. Pat gave me an African garb doll and a beautifully carved wooden tea set. I discovered that it was not the mythical Africa that she went to, but in fact, Tanzania, as Pat told me during our talks. So after high school, Pat made her way to SUNY Stony Brook, where she and the other students demanded a Black dorm and the founding of a Black Studies program. She received her master's degree from New York University, and in 1971 moved to Tanzania to join the revolution. Now, in 1961, Tanzania gained independence from Britain, adopted Ujamaa, African socialism, and invited African Americans to help build the country. Now, of course, the US sent strategically placed Black CIA agents. Pat. Oh, I had to go because of what it promised to be. It was an adventure, and I believed in African socialism. Prime Minister Nyerere was talking about unity and building a nation, nobody getting more than what they needed or deserved, and medicine was free. Oh, it sounded like a place where we could make a contribution. I didn't even wait when I graduated from NYU for my papers. I just left and went to Tanzania. So the Marino sisters established Tanzanian missionary girls' schools in 1958, and the government took them over in 1969. So I asked Pat, how did she involve herself, in the Tanzanian revolution? She said, I went to teach English language composition and Latin at Mwanza Inganza Secondary School. I just lived a life as a school teacher, Supporting the government in that way, not taking expatriate salary, being paid local wages like everyone else. So in Tanzania, Pat taught as a political act. May and Pat. Pat says, my mother was dying to get to Tanzania, and I was the vehicle to get there. In 1972, May Mallory did what any self-possessed African-American radical woman would do when rejecting oppressive systems. She quit her nurse's aide job, told the post office she was moving, offering no forwarding address, skipped paying her phone bill, and as any true African-American radical revolutionary leaving the US to join the revolution would do, she skipped out on her rent. I asked Pat if she had done the same, and she said, no. She said, I paid my bills. My mother was a gangster. Pat says, I knew my mother and grandmother were coming. I did not know when they were coming. So Pat enjoyed her life in Tanzania, having adventures. I met this young man who was an area commissioner. Slick. He showed me around. I was getting ready to go out for our date, and I see this taxi cab coming down the road, stopping in front of my door. Out comes May Mallory and my grandmother. Oh my gosh, the jig was up. They had messed up my thing. But Pat, in her grown, independent woman splendor, maintained her composure and her plans. This young man and I did go out. But Pat says when she returned from the date, oh, my mother and grandmother taught themselves a blue screen. You don't know anything about this person, blah, 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 blah. So that was it. May arrived in Tanzania. Now, Pat indicates that her full independence took a hit with their arrival, but she continued to live and enjoy her independent life, independent of her mother. So in conclusion, these African-American radical women activists created family with each other, cemented by resistance. Ethel Azalea Johnson, May Mallory, Audrey Proctor Seniors, and Pat Mallory raged against oppressive systems. And in their raging, they accomplished amazing and extraordinary things. Thank you.
So we can select. Thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. I, of course, always have questions. I think I'm going to just ask one question of you, and then I would really like for the participants who have questions, if you could either raise your hand or just put a question in the chat, and then we can go from there. So the question for me, and I'll stop the screen sharing because yeah. So the question for me is, I'm always curious about women in the movement and wanted to sort of have you talk a little bit about how the women in the movement understood themselves as mothers, and what are the ways that they centered the maternal, and what did centering the maternal afford them in terms of their radical activism?
Yes. So I think for my mother, Mrs. Johnson, and Pat, they were able to involve their children in their political activism. So for example, Mrs. Johnson's son, he was heavily involved with the Monroe Defense Committee. He went to court in support of May Mallory. He unfortunately was murdered during the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee events. And so she was able to include him fully in her activism. My mother, from an early time period, I don't ever not recall going to Vietnam War demonstrations, not going to the Workers' World Party and pamphleting with the little girl Hindi and Eric that I showed in the first picture. We were all part of the Workers' World, a multiracial organization. And we as little children would go and we pamphlet, we go to marches, we had picnics, we had fun. One of my friends, Susan, reminded me that, we had fun. And we enjoyed the activism. It was just part of our lives. For somebody like Pat, because May had had such a difficult childhood, because she was a child bride and mother, she couldn't co-join motherhood and activism in a way in which aided her children. So Pat, Pat says she did not ask her, did she want to do the desegregation case for New York City? And Pat was, had been traumatized previous to that through what's called shared parenting. And so May just charged on with all of her activism, but she included Pat, but didn't tell her what was going on. So it was very difficult for Pat. And Pat was a different child. That was not for her. And so that's how, who else did I have? Pat, May, and Pat has done the same with her son, keeping him politically active, involving him in, I can't remember the church name at the moment, but it's a radical church in New York City, and such, yeah.
So I have another sort of shorter question, and this is this sort of turn, because you talk about the mythical Africa.
Yes.
What distinctions did they then later make in terms of the mythical versus sort of the real? Was there a transformation of sorts in politics or something else?
I think because I was a little girl when they went to Africa, I was little. And so what I remember is the white wall, this was when you could go to the airport and actually go to the place and see them on the aeroplane. Right. And so I remember the white walls and everything, but I just remember they went to the mythical Africa. They didn't, I don't recall them telling me what the mythical Africa was, right?
Oh, but, so it was mythical for you then?
It was mythical for me.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But on our library, in our family library, we have pamphlets and books about South Africa, apartheid, about the liberation struggles going on in the Belgian Congo and elsewhere. So in our household, I learned about the different movements in the continent. But as a little girl, when they went, I was like, oh, they go to the mythical Africa, And here's a little doll that Pat gave me, and the and the little tea set that she gave me.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions coming from Antonio. Asked, he says, you spoke of the American welfare system further dividing Black families. Will you elaborate on that?
Well, yes, there's been a lot written about this. Nada Sennett and others have written about the fact that, the welfare system for mothers was set up specifically for white women, and they blocked out Black women and girls from the welfare system. And so Black people just, could not get the kind of aid they needed as white people could, white women. So when they started the motherhood programs, the feeding programs, the food programs, they locked the Black people out. They couldn't get it. They just could. I mean, as now, in a sense, I adopted my daughter, and she got WIC. And I mean, them fighting over WIC. I mean, you get one thing of rice, one thing of what do you call it? Bread, a thing of milk, and cheese. You can't live off of that. And so, but there was a way. Madison and others have written, and I can send you the links, the books have written specifically about how it was set up for white women, and it did not include Black, Latina, or even working class Asian women. And they were locked out.
So another question from Will is asking whether we will share this recording, and yes, we'll make it available at a later date.
Yes, Sarah, that's your brother.
Someone,
your mother gave
Sarah
me
says
your
that's
mother
her
gave me that photograph, and I shared it.
So I think we'll also be able to provide some links about additional resources, where to find information. And hopefully we won't, try not to put too much pressure on you on that book, because and so Miles, Miles, your question about where can we find resources to reinforce the materials discussed in the presentation? Where can we go to read further?
Yes, I'm hoping I'm hoping to have my book finished by hopefully by December, and hopefully it'll come out next year when this whole thing is over, the COVID and everything. But there are lots of relevant books that you can look at. Akin Yellow has a book out. There's another book called I think it's called They Shoot First. And there's a number of books about Black women radical activists. There are also a number of books that are written by charlatans. Hey, Becky!
I love again, if you have questions, please be sure either you can raise your hand or you can post them in the chat if you don't want to ask the question yourself. I think I wanted to go back to this moment where you talk about internationalism and the ways that the women sort of turn to look at sort of freedom movements globally and kind of and align themselves with those movements. Can you talk about how that kind of consciousness sort of came about, such that they sort of turned outward and made connections with the Black American context?
I think because they were all very well read. They were organic intellectuals. They had not gone to college or anything like that, but they were well-read women. They belonged to organizations like the Workers' World Party and so on. And so they had international, they had books and stuff to read about it. But I think when you're talking about colonialism and imperialism, you cannot separate it and say, well, this is just happening to us in America. They were able to see, as all of us should, that what happens to us is happening to other people around the world, third world, or majority, or what I discovered, majority world people are experiencing the same exact things. And so they could not separate what was happening to African Americans, to the colonized Vietnamese, to the people, the Batistas, Cuba, the Dominican Republic. They could not separate it from that, and they just didn't. And they were just well read and made sure they knew what was going on.
So I see a couple more questions. Olivier wants to know, was there ever any fear? And if so, how did they overcome the fear and replace it with courage? He says they seem so brave.
Yeah, my mother was fearless. So the only time I recall her even having an inkling of anything was when she said that she saw that these thick-headed white men were following her when she was going to Grenada and Nicaragua. And she just came home just a little surprised that had happened. But I think, they just were fearless. I don't think that, Pat talks about when the FBI came to their house looking for her mother, and she cussed them out and told them, "You find the killers of Emmett Till, get out of our house," as a 15-year-old. They were just not scared, they were not scared. You know, there was too much at stake. Yeah.
And Lemuel is asking, he says, you talked a lot about these interconnecting of international movements. Do you see any similarities today regarding the push against police brutality nationally and internationally in countries like Nigeria, for example?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, what happened when these women were active, it just continues on to this day. I mean, the same things they're fighting. One of the reasons Monroe was such a horrific place was because Jesse Helms' father had brutalized and grabbed this woman across the street and beat the crap out of her, and the police regularly did that in Monroe, Philadelphia, elsewhere, and this continues on to this day. We were just joking today, about how I've been stopped over 9 times by the police. I mean, it just never ends. And so you have these things happening overseas as well, in England, and as you said, in Nigeria, in different places that are just a continuation of what was happening during these women's lives in terms of repression, colonial ideologies, and imperialistic ideologies. Yeah.
What are some of the lessons that you think we can take from them and sort of apply it to or think about those in our current context? How can they help us kind of think through what we're experiencing now?
Oh gosh. I mean, oh gosh.
It's like your dissertation defense all over again, right? I know.
I started to sweat.
I know. Sorry.
I'm gonna be cute too. Look, and I'm gonna be cute too. Can you rephrase that question, please?
What do you think are some of the lessons from the women's activism during their context or that period that we can draw on for our current moment, for the contemporary, given that I think as the question was asked, there are some similarities there, right? What are for us, do you think?
I think, as they belong to several different organizations, trying to find organizations that are like-minded in terms of your activist ideology, finding like-minded people, and then, not, like I said, these women were involved in not only Black nationalist groups like the Black Panthers, and the Negroes with Guns, but they were also involved in multiracial groups like the Workers' World Party and the Youth Against War and Fascism. And so what we have to do in thinking now is find the allies from a multiracial, biracial perspective, multiracial perspective that align with us, with that, whatever you're doing in terms of what's going on. But I just don't know. I mean, I think we're in such a bad state.
We have, yeah. It's. I think everyone's, on edge, right, as we sort of ramp up to the election, and I think there's a sense of this feels, this moment feels very sort of retrograde, right? Like we've been here before. How do we get out of the scary loop?
Right. And I think it's even beyond retrograde. I mean, I've never in my entire life thought that we would be in such a situation, where we're basically living under a Nazi-esque state. I never in my children in cages, on the borders and elsewhere, women being sterilized, against their will, Black and brown and Asian and white being brutalized, by white supremacist police. I mean, this is just, our times that we're living in now are just, to me, they're just unprecedented and, very frightening. And so I mean, you know, I don't even have words. You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, speaks to why there's such interest in this work, in this book, right? And in that period, because I think people are sort of looking back to those moments to think about what are the lessons that we can learn from that, or what are the lessons that we discarded that we probably shouldn't have discarded that we need in this moment, right?
Right.
So yeah, Angela would like for you to hold up the doll again. She says, I make dolls and teach children and adults.
Oh, this one isn't even, I mean, she's just, I think the tea set is more beautiful and representative. I mean, the tea set, if you can see, I don't know how close to get, is you know, has African carving, is quite beautiful. The doll is just a regular, it's a beautiful doll, don't get me wrong, but it's just a regular doll. She's Black. You know, but I mean, I guess her outfit would be considered a little unique. You know, turn her around. She's modeling for you, Angela.
Yeah.
Oh, the costuming you wanted to see, yes. Yeah.
Okay, I see John, who's saying, Dr. Seniors, as further proof of the strong relations formed during your childhood, the two parents of that little boy, Eric, attended your talk and her sister showed up. You brought back lots of memories of meetings with May Mallory and Mrs. Johnson. If you want to collect some memories, get in touch.
Yes, John, I would love to get in touch. Who did I see? I spoke to Sarah, but I have not seen Sarah. I saw Susie and Ellen.
Alejandra has a question. She says, referring to when May Mallory sued the Board of Education in New York City back in 1957 because of the lack of integration between races, do you think schools are still not integrated enough with social races and ethnicities today?
There is a definite effort to keep the schools desegregated. Even in kindergarten through 5th grade, they have advanced placement for children. And usually those children who are in the advanced placement courses are not Black children. In the high schools, you have advanced placement. So you will have a high school that's supposed to be mixed, and the white kids are all in the advanced placement classes and the other people are not. So no, I mean, they have it down so pat to keep the schools segregated. I mean, even in my little neighborhood, the people live across the street, their children are going to a different school than my child. In the whole neighborhood, they are all not going to the same school, you know? So, I mean, there's a definite effort. And then you got this crazy woman, the head of the education division. But no, that has not changed. Yeah.
You're talking about DeVos?
Yes, DeVos. And not only has it not changed, but when my parents got ready to send me to school, they could not send me to public school in Brooklyn because the white people were beating the crap out of Black kids. So I went to Quaker school from kindergarten to 12th grade. Now, how sad is that people who were fighting to desegregate the schools could not send their child to public school because the white supremacists were beating the crap out of Black children in Brooklyn. Yeah. So no, nothing has changed. It just has morphed into a more sophisticated way of keeping Black and browns out of getting a good education.
Yeah. We have other questions about, because I could ask some more questions.
I saw a lot of questions scrolling up there.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Questions and comments. Yeah, I sort of want to ask in my head, but I want to think about women in the movement. I think so often we Well, until fairly recently, much of the history that we've gotten about civil rights and Black activism in terms of leadership was sort of centered around sort of male leadership, right?
Yes.
And so I wanted to think about, I guess I'm thinking about how women function within the context of these sort of radical activist spaces, and what did these spaces look like? Um, and were they sort of distinct spaces from, say, the sort of mainstream civil rights movement? So was there something that allowed for, was there something about these sort of spaces that allowed a kind of activism from women, perhaps, that maybe was restricted elsewhere? I mean, my question's probably not the greatest, but it just struck me as, thinking about what essentially drew them to this form of activism.
Well, I mean, if you read Robert F. Williams' book, and if you read it very carefully, you'll see that the women were the ones that demanded that the Negroes with Guns movement, that the NAACP morph into the Negroes with Guns movement. When the two women were raped in Monroe, North Carolina, the women wanted to go and lynch the white men who raped them. They wanted to go with the weapons and kill them. So if you look at the formation of the Negroes with Guns movement, the women were at the center, Mrs. Johnson and the other women. For some reason, when I guess when men write history, they just exclude us, so they just exclude women from the history. So even when you talk about the Revolutionary Action movement, you hear about Max Stanford. Nowhere in the materials about the Revolutionary Action movement do you see that Mrs. Johnson was the co-chairman of the Revolutionary Action movement, and that the Revolutionary Action movement was riffing off of what the Negroes with Gun movement were doing, because Mrs. Johnson was in Philadelphia, living in Philadelphia, pushing it forward. And so there's a way in which, and then these are not your mainstream Black people. These are working class Black folks, women. And so they're not going to be in the history books, right? Because, we only can have people like, the curly haired, light skinned Rosa Parks, as opposed to Claudette Colvin, the dark skinned little girl, right? And so there's a way in which, Black women are not included. But again, I think it's because of the people who are writing the history, the men who are writing it and excluding us.
Yeah. But do you think part of it also is that we've become so accustomed to sort of male leadership as a sort of default that we also, and I'm implicating myself to some degree in this, sort of kind of normalize that as well. And so it has to be sort of called to our attention, right? That these women were central to radical activism. I think it's why I appreciate your work so much, right? It's because it really is forcing us to kind of to rethink, right? So much of what we sort of like have accepted and normalized in leadership and sort of power.
I have to go to their class background as to why they've been excluded. Yeah. I also have to look at, the Workers' World Party. The Workers' World Party and the Youth Against War and Fascism, the women were right there front and center, leading and founding both organizations and writing, Ellen Catalanato and John Catalanato, who are on this thing right now. The women were right there, my mother and others, the Kessingers, my mother, Eddie Oquendo, he's not a woman, but I mean, the women,
yeah, I know what you mean.
The women were right there, but I think that, I think it's like why the Socialist Workers Party sued the United States government, and now they have Pathfinder books, because these types of leftist working class groups, not only the government tries to decimate them, right? And then when the history is not written, they're excluded from the histories. Yeah. And then, the leaders, that people want to put forward ad nauseum, are like Martin Luther King and, stuff like that, Rosa Parks, yeah, they're not taught. I mean, Damon Evans was telling me that he actually learned about May Mallory at Brooklyn College. So he got an education that many of us did not receive,
College. I'm an alum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So any additional questions? We have a little bit more time. Let's see. There's a question about what have you noticed as far as systemic racism? Can you contrast the difference in time period, or would you say that things are still the same?
I think we're living in an unprecedented time right now. As I continue to say, I mean, this time we're living in is not anything that I ever, thought, we'd be living in. And I think for the young people, it's hard. I think it would probably be hard for you to really understand. I'm an older person. I never thought we'd be living as we are now, again, with children in cages, women being sterilized, white supremacist police brutalizing people, killing anti-fascists. How are you going to kill an anti-fascist person? How you going to do that? I mean, we should all be anti-fascist, it's just, these are these are times where you just want to lay down and cover yourself up.
Tempting, right? Except there's a lot of work and probably,
yeah. So yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
There's another question. I think what is unique about being a woman that leads to thoughts of revolution?
I think women, we are oppressed, and some of us don't even realize we're oppressed, And so, I mean, it's even, I don't know these rappers, but I mean, it's even like Megan Thee Stallion wrote a whole article about being shot in her foot, by somebody she wasn't even dating, in the New York Times. Even if she was dating him, he should not have shot her in the foot. But, I think women are oppressed. Black women especially are oppressed. And so I think that would lead to revolutionary ideologies and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you see as this, any, I'm kind of going back to this current moment. I guess it's my own anxiety about Tuesday and Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday, and that's kind of building to the surface here. I was fine this morning, but I think we're both professors and we teach young people. I teach a course on the civil rights movement. I also teach a course on hip hop, which is about reading, text, performance, visual, all of these things. And I think like in this moment, right, as I'm teaching the civil rights movement course, and I'm hoping that things are kind of sticking, what are some of the questions that you hope young people are asking, or at least sort of asking and are attempting to work through, particularly with kind of encountering this history, right, of Black women's radical activism? What were some of the questions that were being asked then, and what are some of the questions that you think young people can and should be asking about this current moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it generationally, so I'm coming from the Gen X perspective, which is sort of like you come of age in a time when it's like war and there's nothing for you, right? Go build your own thing, right? And so, but I think there's a way in which sort of younger generation was sort of raised on a certain kind of promise and come into the reality that, you know, I see similarities, I guess, between this generation and, you know, my in Gen X. And I'm just wondering, sort of, what are some of the questions that you think they, you know, can sort of contend with that might be helpful?
Yeah, I really, you know, because I'm just shocked, you know what I mean? So I really
Okay. All right.
I
Well,
really
of issues like,
I
you
really
know,
don't know.
the
Huh?
Supreme, the recent
I'm just gonna take like 2 minutes, I think.
confirmation,
If I take over.
Supreme Court confirmation, for example, issues of the environment, thinking about healthcare, because those also are questions that were being asked during the moment, these moments of radical activism, right?
Right. Yeah, and they did not, and I mean, when I'll just go back to when Obama was running for president. I met a lot of people who were very excited about him because they were going to get health care. And a lot of these people, you know, white kids, teenagers, early college graduates were very excited about the prospect of having health care and being, you know, being able to have that. I think that this generation probably, I don't know, I really don't, but I would think that they don't even know what they have lost. You know, I mean, in terms of, you know, the people voting away their rights, in terms of this woman that is going to, is joining the Supreme Court, you know, voting away their rights. Their rights have been voted away in terms of women's reproductive rights, healthcare, you know, education, you know, equitable education and stuff like that. But I think that they probably, I don't know, I haven't spoken to any young people, but they probably don't know what, you know, what this means, you know, what exactly this means and how tragic this whole thing is, right? That, you know, if you need reproductive health care, that you are not going to be able to get it, you know, and that only the wealthy and the rich will be able to get it, but the poor and working class are not going to be able to get it. The environment, I mean, you know, California is just burning, right? Yeah, but I think that I don't really know. I think that they probably, I mean, I try to buffer my child as much as possible. Yeah, see, Damon says the youth have no idea whatsoever. And I agree with him. He said the youth have no idea whatsoever. I don't think they do. I don't think they realize, you know, they know that their rights, all of their rights have been voted away. I think that, you know, that first women's march, the first white women's march, you know, the girl with the hat and the pop, you know, and the women and the white women with the pussy hats in the background. And she's saying, you know, remember 54% of white women voted for Trump. And she got the pop in her mouth and the hat, and she's just standing there. She's at the rally, you know. But I think it's a thing where people don't even realize what they have lost, you know. And even with, you know, protections against police brutality. I mean, I don't know how many people were just floored. You know, I don't know if it was the Ferguson, to see the militarized police, you know, with the trucks, the militarized trucks and the bombs, and even in Portland, you know, that has just happened. That is coming from back a long time, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, where the police were militarized. And this militarization is being used against us, right? But I don't think I mean, I didn't know that happened, that they had I mean, you know, we watched SWAT on TV. You had no idea that the SWAT was the militarization of the police, right?
Right.
So
I think people are kind of getting an inkling now. I think one of the things that I share with students, especially because we're a public institution, is that there is public documentation of how money is spent, right?
Right.
And so you can check the budgets. You can look at the state budgets. You can look at your city budgets online. If you sort of tool around your university website enough, you can find some financial information and sort of capital plans and things like that. It's a little bit of work, right? But it's work that we have to do. I think one of the things that you said that really struck me was that the women in the movement were organic intellectuals, right?
Yes.
So what they didn't have this formal education and training.
No.
They were brilliant politically and culturally,
Yes.
right, and intellectually brilliant. And I think perhaps that's one thing, I mean, that I think young people could probably sort of take, right, is this idea of organic intellectualism, right? The desire to know, to read, to want to learn, to grow, that we saw from women like May Mallory during that period, that I think is really important. This idea of sort of breaking out of a box of education to become, you know, thinking intellectual beings organic.
Right.
I really appreciate you pointing out the fact that they were organic intellectuals.
Yes. And I mean, I have a couple of other theories, but that's the one that just really sticks with me, is the organic intellectual, you know, of them, you know, but yes, I mean, yeah.
There's a question about what are your thoughts on the performative activism that we see today in the Black Lives Matter movement? That's a charged question.
I mean, it depends on what Black Lives Movement you're talking about, right? I mean, so like the women, unfortunately, the women who formed the Black Lives Movement, they took that Ford Foundation and we haven't heard from them again, right? But the Black Lives movements that we're seeing across the country right now with the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, those are real activists, and they are fighting. You know, I mean, that's the same thing we saw with Ferguson. Unfortunately, those Black Lives Matter activists in Ferguson have been murdered, probably by the Klan and the Nazis. You know, they self-lynched themselves, is what has been you know, argued. You know, so I mean, I think that those and there's no reason to apologize for being charged. That was a good question. Another person said, I'm sorry for the charge question. But those are the real Black Lives Matter activists. The women who formed it, it's a shame that, you know, they took that Ford Foundation and skipped, you know. But I think that the ones that we're seeing now, that are out there, you know, in the trenches with the George Floyd, with the Breonna Taylor, with the Atiana Jefferson, you know, fighting for, you know, equity, you know, those.
Life, right?
Yeah, those are the ones we need to look to. But I also think that, you know, we need to really interrogate the murders of these activists, especially those ones in Ferguson. They all have been ticked off one by one and murdered. You know, yeah. All
right, we have time for a couple more questions, if there are a couple more questions. Yeah, no, and again, no apologies aren't necessary, but I think the charging was, you know, good.
Yeah,
it's good to
I
understood it as yeah.
It more, if I may, I see a lot of, it was overwhelming to me when I first saw the Black Lives Matter movement come to a head in 2016, and it, you know, drew national attention, and it kind of resurged in the last, you know, year or two, and I see more people behind it. But when I speak to people face to face, I find a real lack of understanding in the reasons for it. And so I was just kind of curious on your thoughts of that, whether it's kind of a lack of education or a lack of understanding, or just a desire to be a part of something, and whether that's productive. You know,
I think that there is I mean, you are a good human being, right?
I like to think so.
And we miss you. We miss you very much. Shakila misses you very much. But yeah, but I mean, these are racist, you know. I mean, they are racist. They don't want to admit that there is racism going on, that Black people are being murdered and brutalized. that children are being put out of their schools, hint, hint, you know, you know, they don't want to admit that, you know, and they want to just move on with their lives and not admit that these things are happening, and be like, well, I do have that one Black friend, or you know, our school does have, you know, Black male athletes in our school, you know, but then, you know, what else do you have? You know, did you, you know, in terms of, you know, equity and equality and stuff like that. But I think that, you know, I think people, you know, white supremacist people do not want to engage in these times. And I don't try to talk to them. I don't want anything to do with them, you know. And, you know, I mean, there's just no reason. There's no reason to waste your energy and your time trying to convince a white supremacist that murdering and brutalizing Black people is wrong. I mean, you know, how could you not see that, right? So why, you know, why waste you know, your beautiful energy on that? You know, yeah, I don't bother with them. You know? Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a good statement.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Any last minute questions? We have a few more minutes. No? Well, if not, we're going to close out today. I want to say thank you again, Dr. Seniors, for doing this amazing talk. I always love listening to your work. I love, there was a one comment that I thought was really, really wonderful, which is that, you know, we need an audiobook. We cannot wait, right? I can actually see, I see a stage play, for example.
Right. Well, I mean,
like,
that's what Virginia Foundation, yeah, they keep on saying, oh, you should take this on the road. You should be an actress doing this thing.
well, I mean, I think, and I think having you read it that way, right, with the passion, with the life, actually also is doing a kind of work in terms of how it imprints the life of these women and the history onto us. So I think that's also, you know, work that you're doing. So
yes.
I appreciate that the liveliness of the reading. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Caitlin, one final thing. Caitlin wants to know if you can share resources to help protesters in Philly.
Oh, what's going on in Philly? Jeez Louise.
Everything is going on. Yeah, no, it's yeah, it's we have yet again another police shooting.
Oh, yeah, geez Louise. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's painful, right? And I
Yeah, it
think
is.
time and time again, I will say that I'm gonna kind of jump into your space a little bit to say one of the things when I teach, I ask my students about Graham v. Connor. That's the court ruling, right? And so I asked to start with that because I want us to think about how we understand what is happening in terms of that relationship between police and Black people, and the fact that the law essentially gives them license to kill, right?
Yeah, it gives them license to kill us, yeah.
Right, and so I start with that. I start with my students reading the law very carefully and interrogating it, and then thinking about how do we change it? How do we get rid of this law that says that this is allowed to happen? And that is in part, not totally, but in part why there is almost never, ever any sort of charges or convictions, right? Because it's a wide berth that they're given in terms of what constitutes fear, for example, or what constitutes sort of, you know, a furtive movement, or how they read the situation. So one of the things for me was when Mike Brown was murdered, I read the police transcript and or the transcript of the interview that the police officer did, and he said he was afraid. and he described Mike Brown as large. And so it was kind of shocking for me when I saw that policeman walk into that, I think it was a 2020 interview room. He himself was a fairly large guy.
Yeah.
And he described a Black child in sort of monstrous terms.
Yes.
Right. That goes beyond, goes well beyond the sort of letter of the law, right? That is something that is inside of him. He already comes to the law with those things built in terms of how you read Black bodies and Black male bodies in particular, such that an 18-year-old kid who's on his way to college becomes a monster and an right? And this guy was, you know, he's fairly large. He actually had to crouch down so his head wouldn't bump into the room. And he's also, you know, fairly not heavy set, but, you know, so it was really strange and shocking to me to see that kind of incongruous thing of the description of Mike Brown as overwhelmingly large enough to overpower this man who, from my perspective, was overwhelmingly large, right? It is law, right? And so it's for us to think about what does the law look like and how do we get rid of it?
Right.
And I mean, police brutality has been, and police violence and police killing has been sort of at the center of so much of Black activism from very early on, right?
From the very beginning.
The very stubborn issue that we have not yet sort of solved.
Conquered. No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah. So if there are no other questions, I want to say again, thank you, Dr. Seniors, for joining us today. I really appreciate you being here. I'm delighted that you are the first speaker in my first semester as director of the Lee Hagan Center at New Jersey City University. So thank you so much for making this a wonderful conversation. And that conversation also could not have been wonderful without the participants and the guests in the audience who joined us today. So I really appreciate that. Thank you all for coming. And we'll see you hopefully at our next event.
Yes.
In December 2nd, we'll be having a Black Lives Matter. Lisa Woolfork from the University of Virginia, who's also one of the co-founders of the Charlottesville Black Lives Matter movement, will be joining us on December 2nd at 4 p.m. So check back for details on that.
Yeah. So and you know, talking about Charlottesville, you know, nobody ever mentions the fact that a young Black man was brutalized by the police, and then that the Nazis tried to sue them. And this is exact a question that my friend from Shaquila's school asked was when I asked all the good white people of Charlottesville, Virginia, because I had been asked by his lawyer to write a letter in response to, you know, a character letter. Not one of them good white people responded or answered me back. And this was a young man who taught their child after school. And so, I mean, when you're dealing with racists, you're dealing with racists, and there's nothing it's just, but that was an eye opener for me. You know, here this young man is teaching their kids. And when it came time to prevent him from having the Nazis put him in jail, not one of the parents whose kids he taught would write a letter for him. You know, I was the only one, you know. And then, you know, too, when we talk about Charlottesville, his name never comes up. You know, it's all, and I'm not trying to be, you know, whatever, but it's all about the white girl who got murdered. But it's his name never comes up. And he was a 19-year-old boy that was brutalized by the Nazis.
Yeah.
And then right next to the police station. Police station's right there.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna come December 2nd to hear that. But I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so proud of all your accomplishments and everything.